What's shaking? Good to have you back. I'm excited that we're all here together today. I'm Rick Jordan, and today we're going all in. I want you to share this out with 3 people today because I was looking through the notes for this show ahead of time, and it's a crazy, crazy transition from rare disease genetic research into dark web monitoring and some other things, which identity theft, data breaches, all that, which is my wheelhouse, of course, along with everything else that I do, being an autodidact or a polymath. Now, look those words up. We don't talk about those much either. My guest today is in Walnut Creek, California right now. I just finished my lunch. He's about to eat his as soon as we're done recording this show. Tobin Shea, welcome, man.
Hi, Rick. Thank you so much for having me today.
Dude, it's good to have you on. And I was looking through everything ahead of time and redoing it. And, my team can see me, when you can't see me. And the faces I was making, I was like, whoa, that's why, that's an interesting transition, man, because I certainly, dang, Tobin's a really, really smart dude, which is awesome. And, genetic disease research, and some of these things, hereditary hemorrhagic, this next word I will not get right.
Telangiectasia.
Thank you. Yeah. I mean, hemorrhagic, sure, but okay. I'm gonna shut up and not try to read these words anymore. I know, right? But it's interesting because you developed several patent pending ventilators, right, in response to firearm safety devices.
Sure, yeah. So during COVID-19 pandemic, I have some patent pending ventilator technology to, that was a big issue early on. And then in response to some of the gun violence we've seen in the US, I also invented some firearm safety devices. So different issues, but I like to think I contributed a little bit to both.
That's interesting. Yeah, I mean, the ventilators are great, but you're talking firearm safety devices. Now, this is also my wheelhouse from having a private protection agency before, too. Yeah, so what specific type of safety devices are you looking at?
Sure. So I took a pretty unique approach. I think we get into this dichotomy, especially mainstream media, politics.
Like right now,
categorize people as We either categorize people as 100% unlimited guns for everyone, or 0 guns never for anyone, no matter what.
That seems to be the way it's presented, isn't it?
Exactly. And I don't think. I don't think it has to be that way. I mean, statistically, it's just impossible to ignore the fact that there are every year hundreds of thousands of violent crimes, assaults, robberies that are actually stopped by firearms. So I think to paint it so black and white as firearm bad is not quite accurate. However, I do also understand that the need and desire to have some levels of safety and protection integrated. So the device I came up with was a device that was made for the AR-15 type rifle, and it essentially kind of bear hugs the magazine area and prevents the changing of the magazine unless you can biometrically verify that you are the legal owner of the firearm. A lot of times in these crimes, it's stolen firearms that are being used, or a parent's firearm, a grandfather's firearm. So by doing this, we cannot disable the firearm's capacity to be used in a defensive situation, but by preventing the magazine from being changed except by the lawful owner, you take a lot of the potential dangers out of said weapon.
That's interesting, man. Now, you're talking biometrics, right? Now, I'm going to give you real world scenarios here, because I have a biometric gun safe right next to it's a small safe right next to my bed, right?
Sure.
And within it is a Glock 19 ready to go, already chambered. It's for defense, just in case something happens, right?
Of course.
The only thing I don't like about it, maybe it's just because of the type that I have, but it takes a little bit. So I'm comparing this to what you're talking about, like to actually read my fingerprint, and when it comes to that, I mean, I've been trained, of course, I've been licensed to carry in 37 different states. That's great. I've had a private protection agency where I could carry full time, even open carry if I wanted to, because of the legality of the business and the protection nature of that security role, and 2 to 3 seconds is like life changing. And this is something that I was taught, and data shows that somebody can run 21 feet in just a matter of 2 to 3 seconds. That's all it is. So that's when I look up, it's like, can't this thing move any quicker? But then is it quicker to punch numbers in and open the thing, whatever it is? But how does yours change that? Because I think it might be different with changing a magazine. Because you can obviously take cover real quick. Obviously, I've been trained in these scenarios, to change out the magazine, but it's still 2 to 3 seconds, wouldn't it be? Or is yours quicker?
Yeah, so you're right. With any technology, there's going to be some lag time, and I've seen the biometric safes too. Usually, you're holding, click. Okay, there it is. So my imagined use case would be that you would actually, like you said, your Glock 19 is ready to go, locked and loaded next to your bed. An unloaded gun doesn't work. That's just true.
Yeah, or even a gun with a safety on, for that matter, because again, that's precious time. Yeah, exactly.
So my imagined use case would the gun would actually be loaded, and the device would not hamper the loading of the gun. So if you wanted to keep it, hot in a safe, that's fine, and you should have, depending on your state, 10 to 30 rounds all ready to go for whatever defense situation you need. That being said, if someone does steal it, they will have a maximum of 10 rounds of potential damage to inflict before that gun is locked out and now useless to them. So it's not a perfect system. If someone steals it, they would have 10 rounds to inflict some damage. But you look at every live shooting scenario, there's mag change after mag change after mag change. While police are getting it under control. Yeah. So this, again, it's a little bit of a compromise, but the compromise will allow for a lawful gun owner to still be safe and defend himself. And it puts a big wrench in the works of, someone trying to use this for, immoral purposes.
No doubt. And I know we talked about before the show having the real talk, right? There's not much editing that happens on the show. And it's because I love the non-political conversations about topics that are heavily made political. Yeah. So when you mention data, I love looking at the data of these things because I'm always just in search for what the actual truth is. And then you can formulate an opinion, of course, based upon that. But the no guns to the let them run wild and free, there's really no data that backs up either of those perspectives, is there?
No, absolutely not. And, I totally agree with you. And I think if we're going to find a solution, that means we need to accurately diagnose the problem first. If we just keep making things up that are very emotional, and, I understand the plea by both sides, but if we're just going to stay in these emotional arguments, we're not really honing in on the real problem, which means whatever solution we come up with isn't actually going to address the problem because we didn't take the time to actually investigate. So I like to look at numbers and try to, depoliticize things wherever possible, because that usually doesn't lead to productive conversations.
Depoliticize, then humanize. That's the best way to take it, man. It's a cool conversation we've developed just off of literally 3 words of your bio. Firearm safety devices. It's awesome, man. I take a look back because Illinois was talking about data, right? I love data. Illinois was the very last state to hold out on a concealed carry license. Yeah, and it even had to be overturned by the Supreme Court in 2013. It went all the way to the United States Supreme Court because the state of Illinois, very similar politics to California, of course, in New York, which happens to be the state that I'm in here is Illinois. It's interesting because as soon as that was done, you saw a sharp drop in the amount of home invasions, in the data of home invasions, because these were, of course, firearms that the offenders acquired illegally, whether it was a stolen weapon or something from a family member to perpetuate the crimes. But all of a sudden, it was like a playing field leveler, and they started, at least this is perception and opinion now. The data was that home invasions dropped substantially. Then perception of opinions from my side, it's like, well, they can get shot back at now. They're more concerned. You get into the conversation like, do nuclear deterrents really work? In those scenarios. And it's like, well, it's held things at bay for about 80 years so far, the nuclear deterrence, but where's the middle ground on these things? And I love finding that, and I think even in something like what you're in with rare genetic disease research, there's probably data that scatters the whole realm of theories and hypotheses, isn't there? And then how do you settle on something in any sort of data research project to get to where it's like, hey, this is it?
Absolutely. Yeah. So in science too, it's funny, during the COVID-19 pandemic, science as a weird abstract thing, kind of trust the science. That was such a funny phrase to me. I just knew where it was going.
Tobin, I like you.
Thank you, Rick. It was just a funny phrase to me. Like, where is the science? Can I look at the, it was weird. But in the science,
if you're not watching this on YouTube, please go at least check out Tobin's facial expressions. It's awesome. Anyways, continue.
It's just so interesting because, being, and I'm hardly going to call myself, in academics, but as someone who's done research and spent a lot of time, learning about science, nothing is absolute, everything is the best leading theory. Data supports the idea that, nothing is so absolute. And it was weird to see it presented that way in the media. But you're right. Everything comes down to the data and the best possible idea we have for now. And then usually in a few years, another study comes up and says, okay, wait, maybe that was all wrong because new evidence. So it's this ongoing conversation. And it's really not as concrete as, it's been presented. So I think that's important for people to understand that most of science is just based on the data. What seems most likely is that, insert hypothesis here or insert theory here.
For sure. And sometimes you take your best guess and then you can get lucky when it comes to data too. No joke. I was just...
a lot of times. Yeah, that's how, that's the scientific method, right? You have a hypothesis, which is more or less a guess. You've observed some stuff and you say, hey, I think this is what's going on. And then you test it and you might be right, you might be wrong, or maybe somewhere in between.
Dude, you just, don't you, I love how you're doing the air quotes with the science, right? Because it seems like a lot of the last 2 years just completely threw the scientific method out the window. Because it came to, yes, you have a hypothesis out of observation, but then there was never any testing after that to either prove or disprove the hypothesis. And I'm whether that was, and I'm not going to go on a political soapbox with this, but if it was masks, vaccines, whatever, there was really never any testing to see what the rates were of transmission or if these things actually functioned. It was just using the data that was made to put in to generate these things. And it's like, okay, here's, as you said, the science, what was the science? Because the science has to include, after a hypothesis, it has to include the testing phase to prove or disprove. Yeah. And then when I said, like, you just get lucky, there's an article I was reading the other day about a medication that was for endometrial cancer, because now we're back into the disease research here, right? And they had a hypothesis that was based upon some data. Then they went and tested it, and dude, they got freaking lucky because they got so lucky that it cured 100%. Mm-hmm. And it was rectal cancer. They used a drug for endometrial cancer, had some data, formulated a hypothesis, then tested it on a group of people, and it was a 100% cure rate. So that was the thing. It's like, we're going to try to prove this. Nobody was ever expecting that because it's never happened before. They got lucky by actually just saying, but the only way you got lucky is actually by doing. Oh man, that's true. People have told me, oh, you're just so lucky. I'm like, no, it's momentum. But dude, you only get lucky because you actually did it in the first place. You actually took some kind of action.
Sure. Yeah. Definitely. So, you're right that it's one thing to have a hypothesis. It's one thing to go through the testing and then and support, your hypothesis and kind of graduate to a theory more or less. And I think in the last 2 years, especially around COVID, I think two things kind of happened. One, it is difficult to do tests, especially when it's non-laboratory setting. This was real people, really experiencing a virus. So, obviously, there's ethical, I don't want to call them boundaries, but parameters to take into account. You couldn't, for example, say, okay, we have 100 people with COVID, we'll treat half of them and not treat the other half. That's unethical. Yeah, so that does make it harder to test things like that, especially when we're going through it now on a, quite literally pandemic scale. So I'll give the scientists a little bit of a slack there. But the other thing that
I won't give the politicians slack, though. I'll give the scientists some slack, but not the politicians.
Yeah, I agree with you there. And that is my next point. The science also got politicized, and I think that is a great disservice. And a lot of the big publications, I don't want to name the specific one, but one of them actually came out and said, for our first time in however many decades, so-and-so journal is getting political. And they kind of framed that as a good thing. Like, we're entering politics. This is a good thing. And I read that. I said, this is horrible. Science and politics, should have very little to do with each other. That's just bad when our scientists are going to science, aren't we trying to eliminate bias? But then by entering politics, we're entering a realm of almost pure bias. So
right on. And that was one of the reasons why NASA stayed private for so many years too, is because it was able to have the separation. Of course, there was federal funding that goes into it, but that's the beauty of it, isn't it? Isn't that how it's supposed to work? Is that private and public are supposed to have this cohesion together in order to do the best for mankind?
I think so too. In theory, it's a great system, and execution. Usually things don't go as planned.
I'll be a little ideological today for you. How about that, Tobin?
Of course.
Yeah. Dude, thanks for indulging me and all that. But I appreciate that we're on the same page on all these things too, because it's just a page of truth. It's down the middle. Just give me the hard data.
I agree. I agree. I think if everyone was willing to sit down with each other and, put aside the passion behind, whatever point they're arguing, I think the middle ground is a lot more reasonable than people think, and it's easier to arrive there if you're willing to give that conversation time of day. That's what I like to think.
Very eloquently said, my friend. Now let's shift gears real quick, because you've done all these amazing things. And by the way, I feel, everybody, that I'm really talking to a genius right now, just because of everything that he's gone through.
Not at all.
It's incredible brain on Zoom right now in front of me. So you went from all of these amazing things, right? Rare disease research and firearm safety devices, and now you have something going on with dark web surveillance. That's a heck of a shift, man. How did that first? We'll get into what you're doing in a minute, but why that shift? How'd you make that shift?
Sure. So, behind the resume, something my whole life that I've been, very interested in, fascinated by is, computers and cybersecurity and, kind of all the things going on under the hood that we don't interact with on every day, like the dark web. So certainly, while I was, getting educated and stuff, all that is very transparent on the resume. But again, behind the scenes, I just have this deep fascination for this sort of stuff, and credit where credit's due. Mostly, our co-founder is he's a real computer genius here, and we actually grew up as great friends together, and kind of as a pet project. Actually, we were curious. We thought, but by exploring the dark web, we're seeing kind of fraud on the industrial scale, really.
Yeah,
and we were kind of curious. Hey, I wonder how many credit cards do you think are getting sold on the dark web? I don't know. That's a great question. Let's find out. So just as kind of a pet project, our co-founder developed a kind of monitoring technology, and we're just looking at how quickly cards were turning over on the dark web. It's very quick, by the way, and
seconds.
Very quickly, yeah. And very, very quickly, we were able to realize this is valuable information we're gathering. And this could be helpful information if shared with the right people. So then we kind of, built a business model out of it and changed the focus to enriching data to a usable level that we could, share with law enforcement and potential clients as well.
That's incredible. So what were some of the biggest discoveries that you found?
Sure. Again, I think when we started, we knew, of course, there's cyber criminals, there's hackers, living in basements and stuff. But when we really started kind of crunching the numbers, I'm talking tens of millions of cards being sold every year. And that's just credit and debit cards.
Yeah.
Then we said, well, oh my gosh, there might be even more social security numbers and people's home addresses, phone numbers, just personal identifiable information, or PII for short, getting sold. And again, it just reached this industrial scale that was kind of hard to fathom, actually, how much was really going on.
It's interesting because, I mean, that's my world that I live in, right? Having a cybersecurity company. And it's the dark web is an interesting thing. You know, there was a documentary that just released a couple of weeks ago that I'm in. It was the sequel to an original called Cybercrime, but this one is called The Dark Web Uncovered. You know, and one of the points that I made in it was, you know, the dark web is actually really just where the transaction takes place. You know, and that's where you are having all of your data and research involved with, but then there's also delivery of the goods. You know, I'd be interested even beyond that. I don't know how you would capture this data. You know, you see the credit cards turn over so much on the dark web, but then how long does it take from that to get to the actual fulfillments of the product? And the product can be, if we're talking real, you know, anything from drugs all the way down to human beings in trafficking.
Sure.
Yeah. And
so we actually, we briefly, unofficially, it didn't pan out, budgetary issues and whatnot. It's a big machine, but we briefly helped out with the United States Postal Service in delivering or identifying packages that were used to deliver, illicit substances, mostly drugs. Kind of funny little unknown fact. It's theorized that the U.S. Postal Service is the largest drug distributor in the world.
That wouldn't surprise me.
Yeah, and pros and cons of the Fourth Amendment are, of course, our individual privacy, but it also makes it hard for the government to, do mass, like package scanning and stuff like that.
Especially when it's domestic. Coming in from overseas, it's a different story because it has to go through customs, and that's scanned all day long. Yeah. Customs,
they catch a lot. Domestic, they have to have pretty compelling evidence to open a package.
You got it.
So you're right. The fulfillment is that's a whole nother crazy process, and to some extent you can monitor, or try to monitor shipping trends and things like that. But I believe it was the Hydra market that was recently closed down this year in a pretty neat multinational campaign. But one of their services was money laundering. So you sent them your Bitcoin and they sent you no kidding, a duffel bag of cash. And how they would do it was, you'd send them your Bitcoin. Of course, they'd probably take a, 10, 15% fee off the top. And then you would get a message of GPS coordinates. And you would go to said coordinates at said day, and you would dig up a duffel bag of money. That's the wildest thing ever. That sounds like something out of a movie. And they moved, who knows how much money that way. Some speculate millions, others speculate billions of money by this crazy drop service of bearing duffel bags around the world for cyber criminals to launder their money.
No joke. I talk to my team a lot here on the cyber side, and nobody within the cybersecurity company was involved with my private protection agency. And I blending those two together, it's exactly what you're talking about. And I would tell stories or just say, well, this kind of stuff goes on, and almost all of them are just disbelief, right? No way that's real. Just like you said, it sounds like it's something out of a movie. I'm like, for real, there's a world out there that is exactly what you're saying right now, that is still just like some kind of drop from a James Bond movie. This is how this stuff takes place. Money laundering is still live and well. And by the way, that's why the Secret Service was actually initiated to begin with outside of presidential protection. Most of what the Secret Service does even to this day has to do with counterfeit money and money laundering. I think that's like 75% of their budget, man. It's insane.
Absolutely. Yeah. I think it was an interesting statistic. I think it was about 1/5 of the world economy is thought to be part of the quote black economy, illegal things, and that comes out to, I think it was something like $16 trillion a year was part of the illegal economy.
Yeah,
that's a lot of money.
Yep,
16 trillion a year. So you bet that there is industrial, business going on at that scale to support $16 trillion. You bet there are delivery services and, money laundering and cash drops. And, only a fraction of that exists on the dark web. But, the point is it's a big industry, and big industries need, large, stable companies to support them, and they exist.
Got that right, man. Wow, this is exciting. You know, we've gone such through an array of conversation today.
Sure.
Starting out with 3 words from your bio about firearm safety, going into genetic research and dark web surveillance. Man, you've done so much. You know, and it's interesting how you've started to cross all these different thresholds, but I see the common thread across all of them, man. And it's data. Really, if I were to phrase it a different way, it's truth. You know, that's what I appreciate. It's about what you're doing, and I can't wait to see what you're going to do next. Now, man, we're gonna stay in touch for sure, and I'm excited to see what is next. You got to have something cooking up in that amazing, ginormous brain of yours.
Thank you so much. Yeah, no, I would certainly love to stay in contact. But you're right, data, truth, and when I meet clients or potential investors, fundraising. I get questions, science background, that's interesting. How'd you get into this? And I always say, I'm a scientist first. Everything we do here at Mindwise, our cybersecurity fraud prevention company, it's all about the data. It's all backed by data. So scientist first.
Brilliant. Website, mindwise.io. Check it out. Connect with Tobin on LinkedIn, it looks like. Tobin Shea, S-H-A. Dude, thanks for coming on today, man. I appreciate the conversation.
Thanks so much, Rick. It was great talking to you.